Arthur, are you going to play for England? No, why not?
After when I played for Liverpool, I will play for Tottenham.
Happy and dreaming of a football career, this is how Arthur's uncle wants us to remember this little boy.
Bye, Arthur!
It is how his community will remember him as they gather today in their hundreds for a vigil. Tributes to a 6-year-old.
In the early hours of 17th June 2020, at a hospital in the West Midlands, doctors made the decision to switch off the life support machine, keeping 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo-Hughes alive. Just 3 months earlier, he had been a healthy, happy boy who loved playing football and cricket, enjoyed his food, and was deeply attached to his extended family. By the time emergency services were called, his body was covered in more than 130 bruises. He was severely malnourished, and he had suffered a devastating head injury caused by severe force equivalent to the trauma of a high-speed road traffic collision. His blood had been poisoned with salt, to such an extent that standard hospital equipment could not accurately measure the sodium levels. As the judge later described in sentencing, this was one of the most distressing and disturbing cases he had ever dealt with. Arthur had endured the most extreme suffering at the hands of both his father and stepmother. Yet this is not only a story of individual cruelty. It is the story of a child who was failed repeatedly and catastrophically by the very system that existed to protect him. This is the story of how a 6-year-old boy came to be left standing alone for up to 14 hours a day, starved, beaten, and ultimately killed, while multiple warnings reached the agencies responsible for his safety. It is the story of how those warnings were not acted upon in time, and how systemic weaknesses during the COVID-19 lockdown allowed a vulnerable child to fall through the cracks. Welcome to this documentary on the murder of Arthur Labinjo-Hughes. In the pages that follow, we will examine not only the severe and prolonged abuse inflicted upon this little boy, but the chain of events and decisions that made his suffering possible. We will trace the timeline from a happy child's life disrupted by family tragedy, through the lockdown move that placed him in danger, to the multiple missed opportunities for intervention by social services, school, and family. By the end, you will understand the specific failures that allowed a pattern of escalating harm to continue unchecked. You will see how disguised compliance by the adults in the home, combined with weaknesses in information sharing and critical professional challenge, created the conditions for tragedy. This is not a story of one monster in the dark. It is a story of how ordinary systems and ordinary people can fail a child in plain sight. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes deserved to be protected. What happened to him reveals uncomfortable truths about child safeguarding that remain relevant today. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was born in 2014. By the age of 6, he was described by those who knew him as a cheeky, but not naughty child. He loved school. He enjoyed playing cricket and football. He had a particular affection for his Birmingham City football shirt. Most of all, he loved being with his extended family, his paternal grandmother, uncles, and cousins. He was a boy who needed reassurance. When his mother, Olivia Labinjo-Hughes, was arrested in February 2019 for the manslaughter of her partner and later sentenced to 11 years in prison, Arthur experienced nightmares and anxiety when people he loved left him. Until March 2020, Arthur had been living primarily with his father, Thomas Hughes. The relationship between father and son had its challenges, but Arthur was generally cared for. Then the COVID-19 pandemic struck. On 23 March 2020, the United Kingdom entered its first national lockdown. Arthur moved into the home of his father's new partner, Emma Tustin, in Shirley, Solihull. It was intended as a temporary arrangement during the crisis. It became the place where Arthur would spend the final 3 months of his life. No one outside that house could have known then how quickly the situation would turn from difficult to deadly. Arthur was a vulnerable child who had already lost the daily presence of his mother. He needed stability, love, and protection more than ever. Instead, he entered a household where he would be systematically isolated and harmed. Thomas Hughes had cared for his son reasonably well before he became involved with Emma Tustin. Court evidence later showed that the relationship fundamentally altered his priorities. The judge concluded that Hughes' infatuation with Tustin had obliterated all love for your son. What had once been a difficult but functional father-son relationship quickly deteriorated once Arthur moved into Tustin's home during the first national lockdown on 23rd March 2020. Emma Tustin, who was described in court as giving copious amounts of love to her own 2 children, took a very different view of Arthur. She came to see him as an obstacle. According to the evidence presented at trial, she blamed the 6-year-old for causing tension in her relationship with Hughes and even held him responsible for her miscarriages. In her mind, Arthur was not a vulnerable child in need of care, but a problem that disrupted the life she wanted. This perception shaped almost every interaction she had with him from the moment he arrived. The change was immediate. Arthur was cut off from his extended family, particularly his paternal grandmother, who had previously been a consistent source of support. He was no longer allowed normal interaction with Tustin's children. He was made to sleep alone on the hard floor downstairs, without a mattress. Most significantly, he was subjected to a rigid punishment position, forced to stand motionless and alone in the hallway for the majority of each day. What began as a supposed method of discipline quickly became the central feature of his daily existence. Text messages recovered from the couple's phones revealed how they discussed and justified these measures to each other. Arthur's distress, his crying, and his repeated requests for food and water were dismissed as naughtiness or manipulation, rather than recognizing the signs of a deeply unhappy and frightened child. Both adults interpreted his behavior as something that required further punishment. The more he suffered, the more they appeared to view him as difficult and deserving of the treatment he received. This was not a gradual escalation that developed over months. The pattern of isolation, control, and physical punishment was established almost as soon as Arthur moved into the house. By the time social services visited in April 2020, the regime that would eventually kill him was already firmly in place. The adults responsible for his care had created an environment in which his suffering was not only permitted, but actively maintained, and in which his attempts to seek comfort or relief were treated as further evidence of his supposed bad behavior. What had begun as strict control in late March quickly hardened into something far more deliberate. By early April, Arthur was no longer simply being disciplined. He was being systematically broken. The regime imposed on him was not the result of sudden outbursts of anger, but a sustained pattern of punishment that both adults maintained and justified to each other. CCTV footage recovered from the house provided the clearest record of this escalation. On 12 June 2020, Arthur was forced to stand in the punishment position for more than 14 hours. The following day, the footage showed him standing for almost 12 hours. On 14th of June, it was nearly 11 hours. Even on 15th June, the day before the fatal assault, he was made to stand for 6.5 hours. These were not isolated incidents. Messages between Hughes and Tustin indicated that this form of punishment had already become routine in the weeks before the cameras captured it. Arthur was made to stand motionless in the hallway, often in a thick onesie on some of the hottest days of the year, while the rest of the household continued around him. Alongside the standing, Arthur was subjected to regular physical beatings. A post-mortem examination later documented more than 130 bruises across his body, many of them in areas inconsistent with accidental injury. He was also systematically deprived of food. At the same time, he was being poisoned with salt. Medical evidence established that he had received a very large dose of salt in the hours before his death, in addition to smaller doses administered over a longer period. This explained why he would cry out for food and then reject what was offered to him, and why he appeared constantly thirsty. His thymus gland was found to be atrophied, a recognized medical indicator of prolonged abuse and stress. Audio and video files recovered from the phones revealed the psychological torment Arthur was enduring.
I was gonna be
He could be heard crying, calling out for his grandparents and uncles, hitting himself, and repeating that nobody loved him and that he was hungry and thirsty. These recordings were not hidden from the adults in the house. Both Hughes and Tustin had access to them. The judge would later state that anyone who watched those videos and listened to those audio files would have recognized Arthur's condition as a desperate cry for help from a deeply unhappy child. Yet neither adult intervened to help him. Instead, the cruelty took on a deliberate and spiteful character. Hughes was captured on CCTV walking past his son, who had already been standing for hours, in order to buy ice creams for himself and Tustin without bringing one back for Arthur. Tustin was recorded rolling Arthur out of bed the day before he died. Hughes tore up Arthur's beloved Birmingham City football shirt. In text messages, the couple referred to Arthur in dehumanizing terms, calling him a click, a shit, and comparing him to Satan or Hitler. These were not expressions of momentary frustration. They reflected a sustained attitude in which Arthur had been stripped of any claim to care or basic humanity. It is particularly striking that this abuse took place in a household where Tustin's own 2 children continued to live what appeared to be a normal life. They were not subjected to the same regime. They were not forced to stand for hours, denied food, or treated with contempt. The contrast made clear that the cruelty directed at Arthur was not the product of general dysfunction or an inability to cope with children. It was a targeted and sustained campaign against one specific child. By the beginning of June, Arthur's existence had been reduced to a narrow and harsh and relentless routine. He was isolated, hungry, in pain, and subjected to almost constant punishment. Both adults in the house knew the full extent of his suffering. They had seen the videos, they had read each other's messages, they had witnessed his physical and emotional deterioration. Yet the pattern continued, and it continued with their active participation.
Arthur, are you going to play for England? No! Why not?
After when I play for Liverpool, I'm going to play for Tottenham.
So you're going to play for Liverpool, then Tottenham. What about England?
After when I'm in Tottenham.
Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was not unknown to children's social care. By the time he moved into Emma Tustin's home in March 2020, concerns about his welfare had already been raised on multiple occasions. His paternal grandmother had contacted services after noticing bruises on his body. The school had also expressed worries about his appearance and behavior. These reports meant that Arthur was already on the radar of professionals before the most serious period of harm began. The most significant opportunity for intervention came in April 2020. The grandmother had taken photographs of deep bruising on Arthur's back and provided them to social services. A social worker visited the family home that same month. During the visit, Arthur was seen with visible injuries. The adults offered explanations for the marks, and these explanations were accepted. No robust multi-agency child protection procedures were triggered. The case was closed at the end of April 2020, less than 2 months before Arthur's death. The subsequent national review into Arthur's case, published by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, identified a series of interconnected weaknesses in professional practice. One of the central findings was the poor quality of information sharing between agencies. Concerns held by different professionals were not effectively brought together to form a complete picture of the risk Arthur was facing. As a result, no single agency held the full context needed to make an informed decision about his safety. Another key issue was the lack of robust critical thinking and professional challenge. Practitioners tended to accept the explanations offered by Thomas Hughes and Emma Tustin without sufficient scrutiny. The review noted that the couple presented as cooperative and plausible, which appeared to reduce the level of professional curiosity about Arthur's actual daily experiences. This problem was compounded by a failure to properly assess the possibility of disguised compliance, where parents appear to engage with services while continuing to cause harm to the child. The national review also highlighted that statutory multi-agency child protection processes were not triggered at key moments when they should have been. Instead of escalating the case to a formal child protection plan, professionals relied on lower-level assessments and single-agency responses. This meant that the level of oversight and coordination remained insufficient given the accumulating evidence of harm. These weaknesses were not entirely new. The review made clear that many of the practice issues identified in Arthur's case reflected long-standing problems in the child protection system, rather than difficulties caused solely by the COVID-19 pandemic. While the pandemic undoubtedly placed additional pressure on services, the fundamental shortcomings in information sharing, critical analysis, and decision-making had existed before the first lockdown began. By the time the case was closed in April 2020, Arthur was already living in an environment of escalating harm. The professionals involved had received reports from family members, had seen physical evidence of injury, and had conducted a home visit. Yet the response remained limited. The system did not connect the separate pieces of information into a coherent assessment of serious risk, nor did it apply the level of scrutiny and multi-agency coordination that the situation required. The closure of the case effectively removed the last formal opportunity for external oversight of Arthur's welfare before his death in June. What followed was a period in which the harm he experienced became more intense and more sustained, without any further professional intervention. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was betrayed first and foremost by the two adults who held the greatest responsibility for his care and safety. His father, Thomas Hughes, and his father's partner, Emma Tustin, were not simply unable to meet his needs. They actively chose to cause him harm and to maintain that harm over a sustained period. Thomas Hughes had previously cared for his son in a manner that, while not without difficulties, did not amount to the level of cruelty seen after March 2020. The evidence presented at trial showed that his relationship with Emma Tustin fundamentally changed his behavior towards Arthur. The judge concluded that Hughes became so focused on his new partner that it obliterated all love for your son. Rather than protecting Arthur from the emerging pattern of mistreatment, Hughes participated in it. He researched and applied pressure, pointing techniques on his son, not as a form of play, but as a method intended to cause pain while leaving minimal visible marks. He was aware of the injuries on Arthur's body, yet chose not to intervene or seek help. In doing so, he placed his relationship with Tustin above his responsibility to his own child. Emma Tustin's betrayal was equally direct, but different in character. She came to view Arthur as an obstacle to the life she wanted. Court evidence indicated that she blamed the 6-year-old for causing difficulties in her relationship with Hughes and even held him responsible for her miscarriages. Rather than treating him as a vulnerable child who had recently lost daily contact with his mother, she treated him as a problem to be managed and eventually removed. She deliberately dehumanized him, referring to him in messages, using degrading language, and comparing him to figures associated with evil. This attitude allowed her to justify increasingly harsh treatment while maintaining a normal family life for her own 2 children, who were not subjected to the same regime. What made the betrayal particularly stark was that both adults were fully aware of the extent of Arthur's suffering. They had access to videos and audio recordings in which he could be heard crying, calling for his family, and expressing that nobody loved him. They exchanged messages in which they discussed his punishment and his distress. They witnessed his physical deterioration, including significant weight loss and visible injuries. Despite this knowledge, they continued the pattern of isolation, food deprivation, and physical punishment. The cruelty was not the result of a single moment of lost control. It was sustained, repeated, and carried out with their mutual awareness and participation. Alongside this personal betrayal, Arthur was also failed by the wider system that existed to protect children in his position. Children's social care had received reports from family members, including photographs of bruising provided by his grandmother. Professionals had conducted a home visit in April 2020 during which injuries were visible, yet the response remained limited. Explanations offered by the adults were accepted without sufficient challenge, and concerns were not escalated to the level of formal child protection procedures. The system that should have acted as a safety net did not connect the available information into a clear assessment of serious and escalating risk. In this way, Arthur was let down on 2 levels. He was betrayed by the adults in his home, who chose to harm him rather than care for him. He was also betrayed by the professional systems that had both the information and the legal powers to intervene, but did not do so with the urgency or rigor the situation required. The combination of these failures left him without any effective protection during the final months of his life. The most significant and painful missed opportunity in Arthur Labinjo-Hughes' case occurred in April 2020. By that point, concerns about his welfare had already been raised on several occasions. His paternal grandmother had reported seeing bruises and had provided photographs as evidence. The school had also expressed worries. These reports meant that Arthur was not an unknown child to children's social care when the social worker visited the home that month. During the visit, Arthur was seen with visible injuries. The grandmother's photographs, taken approximately 25 hours earlier, showed clear bruising on his back. Medical evidence presented later in court established that the bruising captured in those photographs would not have faded significantly within such a short period. This created a direct opportunity for professionals to assess the consistency between the reported concerns, the physical evidence, and the explanations offered by Thomas Hughes and Emma Tustin.
Just briefly, what happened?
Basically, he'd gone out to get me a birthday cake and stuff for kids. Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step. Arthur's put himself all over the floor. He's banged himself off the radiator. He's hit me, he's kicked me in the process of me trying to get him back on the thinking step. He's then gone on all fours on the floor and I've told him to get up. And I shut the door over and all I heard was a crack off the floor. He was headbutting the floor on all fours. Headbutted the floor once, said, "Oh, get up, you're going to hurt yourself, I've phoned your dad." He went, "I don't care." At that point he was fine. And then he dropped his head again as I've tried to bear hug him and pick him up, and he headbutted the floor 3 times.
Here on this
carpet? Round about, the door was shut, so if you go in, I'll show you. Because it's probably about here his head was, but it's concrete, there's no underlay under that.
However, the response remained limited. The adults provided explanations for the marks on Arthur's body, and these explanations were accepted without sufficient further scrutiny. No robust multi-agency child protection procedures were triggered. There was no escalation to a formal child protection plan, nor was there a coordinated effort to gather and analyze the full pattern of concerns that had been raised by different sources. The case was closed at the end of April 2020. This closure represented the last realistic window for meaningful external intervention before Arthur's death. In the weeks that followed, the level of harm he experienced intensified significantly. By early June, he was being subjected to prolonged periods of standing as punishment, food deprivation, and other forms of mistreatment on a daily basis. The window for protective action had effectively closed. The National Review into Arthur's case highlighted that the failure to properly assess and respond to the information available in April 2020 reflected deeper issues in professional practice. These included a tendency to accept parental explanations too readily, insufficient consideration of the possibility of disguised compliance, and a lack of robust processes to connect separate pieces of information into a coherent picture of risk. The review noted that when concerns are raised by family members and supported by physical evidence, professionals need to apply a higher level of critical analysis rather than defaulting to the least intrusive response. It is important to recognize that this was not simply a matter of one visit going wrong. The April 2020 contact took place within a wider context in which multiple indicators of harm had already accumulated. The grandmother had raised concerns more than once. The school had flagged issues. Arthur was already known to services. Despite this, the system did not treat the situation with the level of urgency and coordinated scrutiny that the evidence warranted. By the time the fatal assault occurred on 16th of June 2020, Arthur had been living for nearly 2 months without any active professional oversight. The decision to close the case in April had removed the only formal mechanism that could have provided ongoing monitoring and potential intervention. What followed was a period of escalating harm that went entirely unchecked by the agencies responsible for his protection. The April 2020 visit therefore stands as the clearest example of a missed opportunity in this case. It was the point at which professionals had direct contact with Arthur, access to physical evidence of injury, and knowledge of previous concerns. The failure to act decisively at that stage meant that the subsequent deterioration in his circumstances occurred without any external safeguard in place. On the evening of 16th of June 2020, Emma Tustin carried out the final assault on Arthur Labinjo-Hughes inside the home they shared in Solihull. She shook him with significant force, causing his head to be hyperextended and struck against a wall or the floor. Expert medical evidence later established that the level of force used was severe and consistent with injuries that might otherwise be seen in a high-speed road traffic collision. Arthur collapsed almost immediately and could not be resuscitated at the scene. Following the assault, Tustin took a photograph of Arthur lying on the floor. She then sent this image to Thomas Hughes via message. The act was not an attempt to obtain urgent medical assistance. It was a deliberate recording of what had just occurred. Emergency services were contacted sometime later. When paramedics arrived, Arthur was in cardiac arrest. He was rushed to hospital, where medical staff attempted to stabilize him. Despite these efforts, his condition remained critical. On 17th June 2020, at approximately 1 a.m., the decision was made to withdraw life support, and Arthur was pronounced dead.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
Barely.
Okay, is he breathing right now though, even if he's...
Is he breathing, Tom? He keeps taking big dark breaths. Basically, my 6-year-old stepson is falling, he's banged his head.
Okay.
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
He's lost colour, he's got a big lump on his head.
Is he awake?
So what, sorry?
Is he awake?
He's half in and out,
Okay.
but he's banged his head quite hard.
Is his breathing noisy or abnormal?
Is it noisy or abnormal? It's barely there, he's barely breathing, he's in and out, he's taking it hard.
Okay.
He's basically been treating us all up. Himself on the floor, he's headbutting the floor. I'm trying to pick him up in the process, he's headbutting me in the process.
Okay.
I've got him up, he was breathing like a little bit better at first.
Yeah.
Washed him down, put some water down him, tried to obviously get him like, a bit more colour in him, but then obviously I've seen the lump on his head that he's done to himself.
Right. Help's been arranged for him. Okay.
Yeah.
Try and keep calm for me. Can you get him lay out flat on his back?
Flat on his back.
How old is he?
He's 6, nearly 7.
6 years old. Okay.
Yeah.
Later that same evening, both Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes were arrested on suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm with intent. As the police investigation developed over the following days and weeks, the true nature and duration of the abuse Arthur had suffered became increasingly clear. Officers recovered and analyzed a large volume of digital material from the couple's mobile phones. This included hundreds of videos, audio recordings, photographs, and thousands of text messages exchanged between Hughes and Tustin. The material revealed a sustained pattern of mistreatment that had been taking place over several weeks. Arthur had been regularly forced to stand motionless in the hallway for long periods as punishment, sometimes for more than 14 hours in a single day. He had been subjected to repeated physical assaults, food deprivation, and the administration of salt in significant quantities. Audio files captured him in visible distress, crying, calling out for members of his extended family, and stating that he was hungry, thirsty, and unloved. These recordings had been created and retained by the adults responsible for his care. The investigation also established that both Hughes and Tustin had been aware of Arthur's deteriorating physical and emotional condition. They had discussed his punishment and his distress in messages. They had witnessed his weight loss and the visible injuries on his body. Rather than seeking help or altering their behavior, they continued to impose and justify the regime of control and punishment. The evidence showed that the final assault was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a prolonged period of harm. As the scale of the abuse became apparent, the case attracted immediate attention from both the public and professional bodies. A national review was commissioned by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel to examine the circumstances leading to Arthur's death. Local authorities and partner agencies conducted their own focused reviews of practice. These reviews sought to understand not only what had happened inside the home, but also why the concerns raised prior to his death had not resulted in more effective protective action. The police investigation transformed the understanding of Arthur's death. What had initially appeared to be a single serious incident was revealed to be the endpoint of sustained mistreatment that had gone largely undetected by the agencies responsible for his welfare. The evidence gathered after his death provided a detailed record of the conditions in which he had been living during the final months of his life, conditions that had not been fully recognized or addressed while he was still alive. In the weeks that followed, The focus of professional and public attention shifted from the immediate circumstances of Arthur's death to the broader question of how such prolonged harm had been allowed to continue without effective intervention. The criminal proceedings against Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes concluded at Coventry Crown Court in December 2021, after a trial that examined extensive evidence, including CCTV footage, mobile phone messages, audio recordings, and medical findings. The jury delivered its verdicts. Emma Tustin was found guilty of the murder of Arthur Labinjo-Hughes and of child cruelty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 29 years. Thomas Hughes was convicted of manslaughter and child cruelty. He was initially sentenced to 21 years in prison. Following the trial, the Attorney General referred Thomas Hughes' sentence to the Court of Appeal on the grounds that it was unduly lenient. In July 2022, the Court of Appeal increased his sentence to 24 years, accepting that the original term had not adequately reflected the seriousness of his offending. Tustin's life sentence remained unchanged. In his detailed sentencing remarks, Mr. Justice Wall described the case as one of the most distressing he had encountered. He made clear that both defendants had been fully aware of the extent of Arthur's suffering during the final months of his life. The judge rejected their assertions that they had only come to understand the gravity of the situation after Arthur's death. He stated that they had known how broken the child was and had been pitiless and indifferent to his condition. He further observed that their treatment of Arthur had been spiteful and at times sadistic, and that they had dehumanized him to such an extent that they felt able to continue inflicting harm upon him. The outcome of the trial and the sentences imposed provoked a strong public reaction across the United Kingdom. Many people expressed shock, not only at the nature of the abuse Arthur had endured, but also at the fact that concerns about his welfare had been raised with professionals on multiple occasions before his death. The case prompted widespread discussion about how a child who was already known to children's social care could have been subjected to such prolonged harm without more decisive intervention. In the immediate aftermath of the convictions, the government commissioned a national review into Arthur's death to be conducted in parallel with the case of Star Hobson. The Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel was tasked with examining the circumstances leading to both children's deaths and with identifying systemic lessons for child protection practice. Local authorities and partner agencies also initiated their own focused reviews of practice in Arthur's case. These reviews examined how concerns had been received, assessed, and acted upon, or not acted upon, by the professionals involved. The case quickly became a significant reference point in debates about child safeguarding in England. It highlighted long-standing concerns regarding information sharing between agencies, the quality of professional decision-making, and the ability of services to recognize and respond effectively to patterns of harm. The National Review later identified a number of practice weaknesses, including insufficient critical challenge, difficulties in identifying disguised compliance, and a failure to escalate cases appropriately when multiple concerns have been raised. For many observers, the shock generated by the case stemmed from two interconnected failures. The first was the direct cruelty inflicted upon Arthur by the adults responsible for his care. The second was the inability of the child protection system to translate the concerns it had received into timely and effective protective action. The trial and its aftermath brought both of these failures into sharp public and professional focus, prompting a period of reflection and review that extended well beyond the criminal proceedings themselves. How is it possible that a 6-year-old child could be subjected to months of sustained mistreatment, including being forced to stand motionless for many hours each day? While already known to children's social care, how could repeated concerns raised by family members, supported by photographs of bruising, and a direct home visit by a social worker in April 2020 fail to trigger a more robust and coordinated protective response? These questions lie at the heart of Arthur Labinjo-Hughes' case. Arthur was not unknown to the system. By the time he moved into Emma Tustin's home in March 2020, concerns about his welfare had already been brought to the attention of professionals on more than one occasion. His paternal grandmother had raised alarms after observing injuries and had provided photographic evidence. The school had also flagged worries about his appearance and behavior. When a social worker visited the family home in April 2020, Arthur was seen with visible marks consistent with the concerns that had been reported. Despite this, the case was closed at the end of that month without escalation to formal child protection procedures. The National Review into Arthur's death identified several recurring weaknesses in professional practice that contributed to this outcome. Information held by different agencies and individuals was not effectively brought together to create a clear and shared understanding of the risk he faced. Critical thinking appeared limited, particularly in assessing the explanations offered by the adults and in considering the possibility of disguised compliance. Concerns raised by family members were not always given the weight they warranted, and opportunities to challenge the narrative presented by the household were not fully pursued. These are not merely procedural shortcomings. They represent failures in the basic expectation that when a child is known to be at risk, the system will respond with a level of scrutiny, coordination, and urgency that matches the seriousness of the information available. In Arthur's case, the gap between what was known and what was done proved to be significant. By the time the case was closed in April, the harm he was experiencing had already become severe, and it continued to escalate without further professional oversight. It is necessary to ask what this reveals about the way child protection systems function in practice. Professionals work under considerable pressure, often with incomplete information and limited resources. However, the existence of these challenges does not remove the responsibility to apply rigorous analysis, to connect separate pieces of evidence, and to act decisively when a pattern of harm emerges. Arthur's death shows the consequences when these responsibilities are not fully discharged. The questions raised by this case extend beyond the specific decisions made by individual practitioners. They concern the broader culture and processes within which those decisions are made. How effectively do systems support professionals in maintaining curiosity and challenge when engaging with families? How well do they enable the voices of family members who raise concerns to be heard and acted upon? And how clearly do they define and apply thresholds for intervention when the risk to a child is serious but not immediately obvious? Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was failed both by the adults in his home and by the system that was intended to protect him when those adults caused him harm. Understanding why the available information did not lead to more effective intervention is essential if the lessons from this case are to result in meaningful change. The National Review into the Deaths of Arthur Labinjo-Hughes and Starr Hobson produced a series of detailed and practical recommendations aimed at strengthening child protection practice across England. These recommendations were not presented as abstract ideals, but as direct responses to the specific failures identified in both cases. A central recommendation concerned the improvement of multi-agency information sharing. In Arthur's case, different agencies and professionals held pieces of information about his welfare, yet these were not effectively combined to create a full and accurate picture of the risk he faced. The review called for clearer systems and stronger professional cultures that support the timely and purposeful sharing of relevant information, so that safeguarding decisions can be based on a complete understanding rather than fragmented knowledge. The review also stressed the need to strengthen critical thinking and professional challenge within and between agencies. Practitioners must be encouraged and supported to question the explanations offered by parents, particularly when those explanations do not adequately account for the concerns that have been raised. This includes developing a more sophisticated understanding of disguised compliance, where adults appear cooperative and plausible while continuing to harm a child. In Arthur's case, the willingness to accept the account provided by Thomas Hughes and Emma Tustin without sufficient scrutiny was identified as a significant weakness in practice. Another important area highlighted by the review was the appropriate use of statutory multi-agency child protection processes. The review found that concerns about Arthur were often managed through lower-level assessments and single-agency responses, even as the pattern of information indicated that a more formal and coordinated approach was required. It recommended that safeguarding partners ensure thresholds for escalation are applied consistently, and that statutory processes are triggered when the level and nature of risk justify such action. The review further emphasized the need to develop sharper specialist skills across the children's workforce. This includes skills in complex risk assessment, understanding the daily lived experience of children within their families, engaging effectively with parents who may be reluctant or resistant, and responding appropriately to domestic abuse. Frontline practitioners require not only training, but also ongoing supervision and organizational support to apply these skills when working with families where the risk to a child is serious but not immediately visible. These recommendations address the precise points at which the system failed Arthur. Information was available, concerns had been raised by family members, and professionals had direct contact with him, yet the response remained limited and fragmented. Implementing the changes set out in the National Review would require sustained commitment at both national and local levels, including changes to culture, training, supervision, and interagency working arrangements. The findings of the review make clear that protecting children in complex and high-risk situations demands more than good intentions. It requires systems and practices that actively support professionals in maintaining curiosity, applying critical analysis, and acting decisively when patterns of harm emerge. Whether these lessons lead to lasting improvements will depend on the extent to which they are embedded into everyday practice across the child protection system. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was not a case file or a headline. He was a 6-year-old boy who loved his Birmingham City football shirt, who enjoyed playing cricket and football, and who found comfort in the presence of the people he loved. He was a child who had already experienced loss when his mother was sent to prison, and who needed reassurance when those closest to him were absent. Even in the final months of his life, when he was isolated and subjected to prolonged mistreatment, he continued to cry out for his grandparents and uncles. These details were not incidental. They were part of who Arthur was, a real child, with his own personality, attachments, and need for safety. What was taken from him cannot be measured only in the injuries he sustained or the conditions he endured. Arthur was denied the basic experience of childhood during the last period of his life. He was cut off from his extended family, made to feel unloved and unwanted, and subjected to a daily regime of control and punishment by the adults responsible for his care. A child who should have been protected was instead made to stand alone for hours, deprived of adequate food, and ultimately killed. He was 6 years old. He deserved to be safe. He deserved to be cared for. He deserved to grow up. Arthur's death has now become part of the documented record of how child protection systems can fail. His case revealed a series of interconnected weaknesses, information that was not properly shared, concerns that were not acted upon with sufficient urgency, and a failure to see the full pattern of harm. Even when evidence was available, these were not abstract failings. They had direct and devastating consequences for a real child. Behind every weakness in policy, procedure, or professional judgment, there are children whose safety depends on the decisions made by adults and institutions. The tragedy of Arthur's death lies not only in the cruelty inflicted upon him by two individuals, but also in the fact that opportunities to intervene existed and were not taken. His grandmother had raised concerns and provided photographs of his injuries. Professionals had received reports and visited the home. Yet the system did not respond in a way that matched the seriousness of the information it held. As a result, a vulnerable child was left without effective protection during the final months of his life. Remembering Arthur requires more than sorrow. It requires a clear-eyed examination of why the protections that existed did not function when they were needed most. It demands that those responsible for child safeguarding confront uncomfortable questions about how concerns are received, how risk is assessed, and how decisions are made when a child's safety is in question. His story should not be reduced to a single case that is noted and then set aside. It should remain a lasting reminder of what is lost when systems fail to see clearly, listen carefully, and act decisively. Arthur deserved safety. He deserved to be believed. He deserved to be protected by the adults around him and by the institutions created for that purpose. The fact that he was not is a failure that cannot be undone. What remains is the responsibility to ensure that the lessons from his case are not forgotten and that the weaknesses it exposed are addressed with seriousness and persistence. May his memory compel those who work to protect children to build a system in which no other child is ever again left to stand alone.